Happy New Year, everyone. Thank you for joining the 2023 season premiere of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York City. On Tuesday, January the 3rd, the business of the United States resumed as the 118th Congress was sworn in. Actually, check that. It was 4 days later, in the early hours of Saturday, January the 7th, that the 118th Congress was sworn in, because first, they had to go through 15 absolutely thrilling rounds of determining the speakership. So now the business can commence and let the investigations begin. Meanwhile, the Senate and the White House have agendas of their own, and the Supreme Court has a number of major rulings expected on everything from voting rights and election law to affirmative action during this session. So joining me today to discuss what to expect from our nation's leaders in the early part of the year are two veterans of this program. Steve Clemons is here. He's the founding editor-at-large of Semafor, where he leads its Principles newsletter, a daily insider's guide to power in Washington, D.C. Previously, he was the Washington editor-at-large at The Hill, as well as at The Atlantic, and is the proprietor of the popular political blog, The Washington Note. And Orson Porter, he heads up Teneo's Washington, D.C. office, and he leads our government and public affairs practice. Previously, he was a special assistant to the president in the Clinton White House and was the U.S. Director of Government and Public Affairs at a little sneaker company called Nike. And for our regular audience, of course, you know the drill. If you want to get your Thursday off to a rip-roaring start, you do a shot every time Orson mentions his beloved home state of Wisconsin on here. So you should be pretty lit by about 8:45. So, Steve and Orson, thank you for being here today, and I should mention they are both joining today from the swamp itself, Washington, D.C. So, Steve, I joked about it at the outset, but set the stage here for us as you see it, and maybe give us your impressions of the events of last week, but what that implies then for this Congress, its functionality, and what you're expecting as we head into this.
Well, Kevin, thank you. And let me just start by reminding people that in 1856, Nathaniel Preston Banks became Speaker of the House after 133 ballots. And he turned out to be a pretty good speaker. So those people who think that 15 ballots was a lot, others had it more difficult. But I think that the real setting we see right now, which is fascinating, if you forget the chaos we just saw in the House, we just saw Senator Mitch McConnell, travel, to see the establishment, the building of this bridge with Joe Biden. They were mature, they were stable, there was no drama, and that is in contrast to the chaos that we saw in the House of Representatives. We saw Kevin McCarthy, prevail. I mean, he stuck it out through a lot of ballots in which he was looking at 212 united Democratic votes behind Hakeem Jeffries. I mean, that in itself is a very major sub-story, the ability of the Democrats to hold everything together. But clearly, there are a lot of folks in the GOP caucus that, one, don't agree with Kevin McCarthy, don't trust his leadership, and some just don't like him. And so the process of getting there was very painful for him and painful to watch. And it means really, and I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, is that Kevin McCarthy had to give away things that he didn't want to give away to secure the speakership. And one of the most remarkable things that he gave away was this ability to this motion to vacate, to allow one member of the House of Representatives to stop the business of the House and essentially call for the potential execution of their leader, at least removal from the speaker position. And that means that now Speaker McCarthy is going to be looking over his shoulder every moment that Congress is in session. And it's going to be a tough go. And we've got a lot of big issues out there. And particularly everybody's talking about the debt ceiling debate. But that's one of many, many things out there in which there's no consensus, in my view, between inside the GOP and the Freedom Caucus. Now, people toss around the Freedom Caucus, and I think the Freedom Caucus is the primary focus of the challenge here. But I want to remind people Marjorie Taylor Greene is a member of the Freedom Caucus, and she was strongly supportive of Kevin McCarthy. I think he was supportive of her in the past. That explains that. But the Freedom Caucus did something remarkable. I think after watching 2 years of Joe Manchin basically become the center of power in the Senate and Washington, and seeing how important and influential that inflection point can be at various times. They all wanted to be Joe Manchin. They wanted to remind Kevin McCarthy that they're not the fringe of the party, they're the core of the party. And literally nothing can happen without them basically signing off and giving their consent. So that's the situation today, is the Freedom Caucus has gone from fringe to core in the Republican Party. And Kevin McCarthy, I was on a show yesterday and was asked, do I think he'll make it through the year? And I personally don't think. I think this is the time of surprise and change and disruption, and we'll see how long he does. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think you have a very unstable House, and that's going to have implications both for the White House and the Biden agenda, and for what happens in the Senate.
So if I could just follow up here real quick, because you mentioned in your remarks about what he had given away, obviously to whittle down those 21 votes that were arrayed against him, to get them to either finally vote for him or at least vote present to put him over the threshold. But we still don't know. We know a lot about the way that they're going to what he gave away and how they're going to conduct business going forward here. But there are still details we don't know. Talking about a backroom deal, I don't think there's anything swampier than that in a sense. But what are you hearing about what hasn't yet been sort of confirmed in terms of what he's given away that you fear might be out there?
Well, I don't know if I fear what's out there, but I think the big thing that the side deals we're hearing, we've got a great team at Semafor, and Kadia Goba and Morgan Chalfant, Shelby Talcott are all over this, doing an extraordinary job kind of getting into that mushy stuff of what Speaker McCarthy gave away. And I think there are folks out there that have real concerns, like Nancy Mace and others are very upset about the lack of transparency over some of these deals. But the big things, some of the big things that we know about and that are public, some of them make common sense. We were discussing earlier, giving legislators a chance to read bills. There was so much reaction against the $1.7 trillion omnibus spending package. It was 4,000 pages long and no time to read it. And people just basically rebelling and requiring. So, giving time and assuring time to read and process those bills of several days, I think is, key. We know about committee assignments. These, 3 of these, renegade GOPers, coming on Rules Committee, certain key moves in the Appropriations Committee. I mentioned the motion to vacate, which was probably the biggest giveaway and I think threat to himself that he made part of this. They established a couple of new committees, a church committee, a sort of a redo of the church committee to investigate the weaponization of the federal government, the use of the various investigative agencies like the FBI, IRS, and others, and looking at that committee. They've also established a committee on China to investigate and benchmark China, and whether that will be a serious committee or a posturing committee still has. I talked to Congresswoman Young Kim last night, who has a lot of thoughtful views on China, and she's definitely not a knee-jerk position on the China issue, but they're going to have that there. So there's a lot of that, but I think the stuff that matters to some people is around the debt ceiling. And we heard some members of Congress saying, if Kevin McCarthy isn't willing to sacrifice the full faith and credit of the United States, then he's not serious. So, and you got people see it exactly the opposite. But clearly, the issues about budget, the budget, government debt are issues that Kevin McCarthy has made some commitments that will affect the nature of that debate. So much that Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick is already flirting and trying to find ways to create discharge petition strategies and others to basically recover the debt ceiling legislation if it's taken hostage by the Freedom Caucus. So there's a lot of that stuff out there we're still reporting on and getting into, but that's some of the flavor of it.
Right. So I want to unpack a bunch of that, but I want to bring Orson into the conversation here to kick things off as well. And Orson, your sort of same question to you that I asked Steve a moment ago. Your impressions as we get started in this new Congress, and how last week impacted how things are going to move going forward. But really, Steve mentioned the Rules Committee and the degree to which the sort of hard right faction was able to get itself ensconced in a serious way on that committee. And some of the things that Steve talked about that are going to govern how business is conducted in Congress going forward if you sort of strip away the partisanship and the noise around it, are things that in many ways either are a reversion to normal, which was that for most of history, right, a motion to vacate actually could be initiated by one member, but tradition and norms prevented that from happening, until it was sort of wielded over John Boehner, I guess, and things like, having 72 hours to consider a bill that may run into the thousands of pages is the kind of thing that in many ways makes sense. On the other hand, making spending bills sort of open to unlimited amendment effectively makes it tantamount to a filibuster against any spending bill in a sense. So how do you see the big picture unfolding here?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me on. Happy New Year to our listeners. Congratulations to Steve on a successful launch of a new business empire. For those of us in DC, Steve is a brand, he's a businessman, but the party really doesn't start until he walks in. So I'm so happy for him and he and his colleagues, and I know they're going to do some great things. And Kevin, your intro video was deserving. I don't know why they didn't have you on the awards program last night.
Big question. Everybody's asking.
You need Steve and I in some of those video clips to boost the numbers, but we'll talk about that. So in DC, Kevin McCarthy, and I'm a boxing fan. Usually in the old days, the heavyweight boxing matches went 15 rounds. And now they only do 12. I think they will go back to 15. Kevin is a guy who went the distance, as we would say, the champion's distance, took a lot of punches. A lot of people thought he was going to be knocked out in the 7th or 12th round. But at the end of the day, he walked out of that ring as the champion with the title. And I think those who didn't respect him found new ways to really commend him for taking a punch for 15 rounds and still walking out as the victor. So what is promises kept? What did he promise? I think a lot of this is pretty obvious. Like as Steve clearly pointed out, the first 4 or 5 votes. Yesterday they voted on abortion. The second vote was on China. All of the things that I'm sure the Freedom Caucus said we need has already been rolled out. As Steve also mentioned, I think 6 members of the Freedom Caucus yesterday got appointed to some really powerful committees. So that's a check, and promises kept too. And then, there's a congressman that in DC, the media is saying he should resign. If you saw the news yesterday, Kevin McCarthy was the only one that I saw who looked squarely in the media's eye and said, it is not up to us. It is up to the voters. So I think that has a lot to do with what Steve said. It only takes one person to bring the house down. But that's a new Kevin McCarthy that you probably wouldn't have seen had he not gone through that 15-round battle. So, I don't think it's a big secret. A lot of things are in plain view. And all you have to do is take a look at the first 48 hours of leadership to really know what was promised. And I think promises kept on what was rolled out on some of these early floor votes.
So, Steve, you think then that Santos will remain in his seat longer than Kevin McCarthy will hold the gavel?
Well, I mean, I don't know. George Santos is very hard to predict, and I'm not in that business. But I will say he is remarkably resilient, given already, Nassau County Republicans came out and blasted him. The New York GOP has come out and blasted him and said resign. And this guy's saying, look, everybody knows everything out there. I was elected. I'm going to do the will of the people. And Kevin McCarthy, we saw the ascension of Kevin McCarthy that was based on what ultimately became one vote, as you had members come down and bring the number down needed by voting present, which eventually even Matt Gaetz did. I have to tell you, people, it is fun. It's better than House of Cards ever was when you see Matt Gaetz trolling Kevin McCarthy and saying, why in the heck are you housing yourself in the speaker's office? You're not the speaker. Get your stuff out. So this is just hilarious. And so there is a funny dimension, a comic dimension behind the kind of darkness of what we saw. But George Santos, so far, we have got Kajiwara. I mean, he talks to Kajiwara and just gives her great zingers and said, look, I've lost 6 pounds from doing all this running around. And so we reported that in Semafor. So far, who knows? Santos seems to be, for this moment, impervious to those that are bringing him down. And Kevin McCarthy has given him a ledge to exist under, and he's going to put him on a committee. And so at that moment, you've got wheels going on that are hard to pull off lest he gets censured. I mean, there may be other parts of the disciplinary side of the House that once those get going become unavoidable for Santos and for McCarthy. But I got to tell you, in this age where you've seen presidents do a lot of stuff, subpoenas get ignored. I mean, I don't know what effective discipline in the Congress looks like anymore. So we may see Santos survive McCarthy.
Yeah,
longer than McCarthy.
Get rid of the ethics committee. So I want to follow up then on something, Steve, because Orson brought this up about the early days business that we have seen in Congress so far. I'll come back to China in a moment, but the other thing, of course, is investigation.
Yeah.
And in fact, the front page of the New York Times today, above the fold, every article is about investigation on the documents that have now been found, Hunter Biden, of course, and just the way that they can, the Republicans can go after the finances of President Biden and the like. So. Give us a sense of what you think we should expect on the investigations front here early on.
Oh, we should investigate. I mean, we're gonna see a lot. I mean, that's all they can do. Congress is not gonna be passing stuff. You're gonna see the Senate doing nominations, and you're gonna see the House doing investigations. That's the diet for the next 2 years until you get some sort of clarity and leadership in the country, probably after the 2024 election. So the notion, Hunter Biden, we clearly know is part of it. And look, I don't know how that's going to go. I don't know what the appetite is. There's going to be an appetite in the Washington media community for all this drama, but do Americans care? I was with a bunch of CEOs last night, people that are running real businesses, and they're saying the FAA failure on the grounding of airplanes is vastly more superior and important for the U.S. economy to consider, or how various companies are being beaten in various third market economies by Chinese competitors because the Chinese have a plan, have support, have ability, have long-term vision, surround the companies that they've got out there with various support. He says, and we're obsessed with Joe Biden and whether he had a few classified documents. Now, I happen to be someone who thinks that Joe Biden's teams or his mismanagement of classified documents is a very serious issue. I'm not joining all of those that say, oh, it's apples and oranges. I actually think that classified issues, which Joe Biden knows better than just about anybody because he's been in the business for so long, is a big deal. But to get to your core point, the House is going to be chewing on all of that, and they'll be doing focus groups to say, like we all got exhausted hearing about Benghazi, but Benghazi was the call. Now it's going to be Hunter Biden for a while. There'll be, Joe Biden did it too with the classified documents. We're going to hear lots and lots and lots of that. And it's gonna play out, and there will probably be other things that get drawn into the investigative business. And I got to tell you, if you have a lot of CEOs and businesses listening to this, I took a big poll as I was at Chamber of Commerce dinner with CEOs that flew in from around the country. They're very frustrated with the media, with the political sector, of not focusing on things that really matter to their businesses and the economy. So there's going to be a tension inside the Republican camp if they waste this shot they've got on just stupid investigations that go nowhere, as we have a lot of things that aren't getting done that are really serious for the economy.
But one thing I'll throw out is 663 days until the election.
Did you know that? You have a countdown?
Kevin
he does that every time, Steve, and it's unclear whether he just throws a number out there that sounds
Is that
right.
number real?
Yeah, it's real. And it's going to be really real when the House holds these investigations. And I think, to your point to a degree, Steve, that these House members know that, And not only will they be investigating the Hunter Biden piece, but there's a lot to investigate in the withdrawal of Afghanistan that
Oh, yeah, I agree with that.
Politically. There's a lot to investigate on China and the origins of COVID, on what was known, the majority of America is split on vaccination, et cetera, et cetera. There will be a lot to investigate on the where the money went during the pandemic relief point. And then, of course, there will be some things that will come out in Jim Jordan's investigation of justice and the FBI due to the timing of the news cycle that we're seeing now with classified documents. So, I didn't think that the January 6th committee would be that big of a deal politically during the midterms, but it turned out to be a pretty big deal for some voters who were on the edge of going in DNR. And I do think that some of these investigations, particularly the Afghanistan investigation and others, could bring out some things that could prolong a discussion in that 663 days that you guys don't believe me, could become a political sore that could grow bigger as we get closer to the election.
I completely agree with that. Completely agree with everything Orson just said. That's absolutely right, particularly on Afghan, because there are a lot of issues. What I think, just to add a point, because I do think because of the near parity of power, but the Republicans have a slim majority. You're going to have a breakdown in divided government, but and so we sort of say, oh, what they're going to do is use their power to investigate. But what Orson said is really important, is that there are important issues that are bipartisan interest in the Afghanistan pullout. There's bipartisan interest in issues related to masking and COVID, and also various issues about how the IRS has been manipulated, et cetera. So there are legitimate investigations that will be you'll have. Ro Khanna wants to be a member of the China committee. So you've got the interesting embers of bipartisan interest around some of these things, so I shouldn't mock the fact that the House is just going to do investigations. There will be some important stuff. So just agree with Orson on
that. And Steve, I want to ask Orson something about something you just brought up a moment ago regarding the position that CEOs are finding themselves in this new environment. And that brings up the China issue, of course, which has been the other major issue that's been front and center since the Congress convened. And I believe it was you and Semafor actually that kind of broke the news that the new foreign minister of China was going to be the China's ambassador to the United States, Qin Gang. Qin Gang has started to make some moves in the aftermath of that meeting between Xi Jinping and President Biden. That was an endeavor to put a floor under a deteriorating relationship, and it looks like Qin Gang has sort of made moves continuing in that spirit. Some of the more vociferous wolf warrior diplomats have been kind of reined in and reassigned. But I think, would you expect that Kevin McCarthy is going to follow through on what he had talked about last year, and that he will make a very early trip to Taiwan following Nancy Pelosi's trip last year? And while the Chinese are highly cognizant that there's a lot more space between McCarthy and Biden than there was between Pelosi and Biden, China tends to look at the hierarchy of things. They see that he is second in line to the presidency. And perhaps more importantly, they'll just use that as an excuse to continue to tighten the noose around Taiwan a little bit anyway. But are you anticipating that will happen?
Yeah, I mean, Qin Gang, I did break that news that he was moving there, and I think that his hardest, darkest time when he was here, in his words, was the Nancy Pelosi trip to Taiwan. I think there is an expectation and concern about Kevin McCarthy likely going to Taiwan. Kevin McCarthy has said he wants to go to Taiwan, and I think that it's now there. It's one of the few moments where Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy were on the same page, and I think that at the time when I was writing about this issue, in a way, I found it remarkable. If I were on the Chinese side, I said, you know, it's sort of interesting to see that there was a debate among the strategic class in Washington. The Pentagon, other players clearly did not want Nancy Pelosi to go. They didn't tell her not to go, but you saw the tension, and seeing that tension may have been heartening to some degree. The Chinese, Qin never cut off relations with the White House, continued to talk to the White House through this, and to some degree, while Qin will say, hey, our response to Nancy Pelosi's trip was missiles, because they did live missile tests around Taiwan and did exercises replicating some of the elements of what an invasion would look like. I think this is the one area where real conflict and war could happen. And it's one of the things that I think the foreign minister and his elders and leadership up to take incredibly seriously. So, yeah, I worry about that dimension of it. That said, on the broader U.S.-China relationship, which everybody feels is getting tenser and tenser, and as Orson said, with the election on this China committee and others, overwhelming bipartisan support for doing this. There's bipartisan support for kind of China bashing or China threat assessment kinds of stuff going on right now, with the exception that if you go back to the Bali summit in Indonesia between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, there was a definite neutralization of some of that tension, a kind of shift towards finding areas, climate, getting back to talking to each other after the Pelosi trip and the damage that it did, both on climate discussions and military to military discussions. Both of those are getting back on going again. But I think that the next 2 years, the Biden administration is going to have to figure out how does it continue to pump up American science capacity, chips capacity, investment in infrastructure, which is in part the way they're responding to China. And how do they take this globally by way of transnational partnerships that can be toughened up and strengthened to compete with China? I think that's going to be without hyperventilating into a jingoistic / racist / kind of fear mongering with China that ends up creating tensions that can go in very unexpected directions.
So Orson, I want to explore this from a slightly different perspective for a second, because you and I are in the business of working with these CEOs, and the other side of what Steve is talking about, this on the one hand, it sounds positive that there's bipartisan sort of agreement on having to be tough on China. On the other hand, that can also create a little bit of an arms race. Everybody's trying to outdo each other as being more and more hawkish on it. But we know on the other side of this that the dynamic in terms of how corporate America is viewed in Washington has also evolved. It's not the alignment of the Republican Party being the party of big business and so on can't be counted on in the same way that it has in the past. If anything, there's also sort of bipartisan support for a lot of corporate bashing going on right now. So and you've talked about how that companies ought to get prepared for getting hauled in front of Congress on a lot of different subjects. And one of those is going to be how they are dealing with China. And as there's a increasing sort of skepticism against woke capitalism or even ESG, generally speaking, in Washington, they will call out companies for being hypocrites, for being so ESG friendly in the U.S., but continuing to do business in China or source from China or what have you. How do you see the China story playing out for corporates as they are dealing in Washington?
Great question. So, I think it really boils down to recent legislation passed. A lot of these corporations may be receiving tax credits, may be receiving federal support through the IRA bill and et cetera. And I could easily see members of the Freedom Caucus and others really asking tough questions to corporations and CEOs on how could you receive IRA funds but still make the majority of parts in China. There will be a whole lot of discussion on reshoring and made in America in this new Congress, and I could easily see Congress calling in CEOs who have been a proponent and have made it the transition successfully, and I could see this Congress calling in CEOs who might not have taken the first step. One thing to point out is the new chair of the Ways and Means Committee, Jason Smith, I think is his name, Congressman, immediately came out with a statement when he was selected that he wants to explore tax credits and really support companies who make the right decision on moving supply chains out of China to the U.S. And I could, as Steve said, there's a whole lot of bipartisan support on bashing China. I guarantee there'll be a whole lot of bipartisan support on building tax credits and really rewarding corporations who might move their supply chains back to the U.S. So, through the litany of the political lens of how do we attack Biden and also put pressure on these corporations, I think there will be connectivity on legislation and corporations who have received support. But in the same regard, I do think in a bipartisan voice, rewarding corporations and punishing potentially corporations who might oppose this tax credit, who might be supportive, might be one angle. So, there's a variety of ways. Of course, you'll weed into the human rights discussion at some point. But right now, the reshoring, made in America, the possibility of putting pressure on the Senate to agree upon some kind of new form tax credit, as we saw what I think was popular, the CHIPS program, is something that corporate America should be prepared to discuss.
But I think one other element, if I may add, Kevin, discussed it again with some CEOs last night, and also I did it publicly, so it could be on the record, with Kathy McMorris Rogers, who's the incoming chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee. She voted against the CHIPS Act, and I was really interested in that because she's very pro-science, she's very pro-CHIPS. I said, why did you vote against the CHIPS Act? And she said, because people sort of hear that we're going to be investing in this, these new plants and facilities, Intel, et cetera. But he said, Steve, we can't get the permitting process around building these new facilities hasn't been thought through, and the delays and whatnot. It's a lot like the energy, both renewables and fossils, the permitting side. And she says the whole permitting ecosystem is very hostile to these kinds of national, public necessary needs. And so that's why she was a no vote on that, not that this is a vote. So I think this broad side of, are we getting the ecosystem right? Is the environmental and sustainable growth community going to be on board with the kind of national industrial policy agenda for competitiveness reasons? There's going to be some real tensions in there I see coming up. And, whenever I hear people about, I would love onshoring. And this really all started, a lot of it, over the heart attack and the seizures that this country had, realizing how dependent it was for active pharmaceutical ingredients on China. And, when you kind of look at where these things are sourced and why they're there are a zillion different reasons: regulatory reasons, cost of production, transportation. And so to move that whole ecosystem back to the US, which I support, is going to require that kind of whole of government, whole of states, whole of purpose. And it's going to be super expensive. And as I talk to people in the business community, their fear even about that is price stability and having commitments in terms of the purchasing over the long term to justify those investments. And I have to tell you, just sitting here in DC with Orson, I don't see that kind of debate and discussion really happening at the deep level that a lot of CEOs need to hear and feel and sense to make sure that this process continues to move productively. So I think we're at the tip end of a big, deeper debate in the country that's unresolved.
Yeah.
And I would say, just from talking to corporate managements, outside the Beltway, the conversation becomes ever more complex, right? I mean, diversifying supply chain out of China is maybe one question, but reshoring into the United States is an entirely different one. There's a whole world that's out there that's competing for that business, and there's a lot of optionality out there. So I want to move, though, to something else you brought up at the very beginning, Steve, and we knew we were going to come to, which is spending bills and obviously the debt ceiling that is looming out there. And I believe Goldman Sachs has suggested that it's going to be around late August, September, that the debt ceiling issue will become, will be the issue. But before we do that, maybe you could just walk the audience through here a little bit, just given the math of Congress, right? With this very slim Republican majority, it has got this hostile wing that seems, very willing to blow things up. Just sort of maybe explain mechanically how this ought to work when you still have, the overwhelming majority of the GOP not subscribing to that kind of extreme wing. Plus, you've got a Democratic caucus that thus far looks like it's going to stick together quite well. How do you see, how effective can this cabal be at holding?
I think it's really, look, I think there are different potential stories. One story is it's highly fragile, can fall apart at any moment, motion to vacate can be called, or that this Freedom Caucus can continue to assert itself and its prerogatives in very dramatic, flamboyant ways. That's one thing. Another side is that perhaps, and look, I don't even know if I agree with what I'm about to say. Maybe some of the silver lining in what the Freedom Caucus has gotten McCarthy to agree to is to democratize to some degree, or sort of decentralize some of the power around the speaker's ability to set the agenda, to basically dictate what will be dealt with and what won't be dealt with, and kind of move some of that power to the committees. Will benefit not just the Freedom Caucus, will benefit other players in that system too. And one thing we haven't been giving a lot of attention is another potential renegade group is the Problem Solvers Caucus, right? So Brian Fitzpatrick cares that the folks that are in the center may in fact assert themselves, and we've seen Brian Fitzpatrick essentially saying that's what they're exploring. That may not work with a discharge permit, but beginning to anticipate that they need to offset the power of the Freedom Caucus. And now with some of the deals that have been made, they've got the ability to bring legislation forward. And guess what? They can ally with the Democrats. So the Democrats, if they remain united, or if there are enough of them, can actually hijack the circumstances now and then when they need to. I don't know how it will affect their messaging or politics, but there's an interesting opportunity for Hakeem Jeffries, who's a very smart guy in this. And there's an interesting opportunity for Josh Gottheimer, Brian Fitzpatrick, those folks in that kind of no labels-ish Problem Solvers Caucus wing. And I think that's a second story of what could happen. But I think the big thing is that previous speakers have almost autocratic control of the agenda of what gets dealt with in no, and that may shift and change with some of the rules things. So I don't know if this is right, but we actually may see some productive steps that come out of this and some bipartisan deals as the response to curb the power of the Freedom Caucus.
So what are you guys expecting in terms of on spending bills, in an environment where, you can, where spending bills are open to unlimited amendment? Is this, how do you expect this to play out? There's been a lot of talk specifically on the defense budget. There's been talk about support for Ukraine at a critical moment where it's clear that this war is going to continue well into this year, if not beyond. So before we get to the debt limit risk, how do you guys see the spending bills dynamic playing out?
I just would throw out to Steve's earlier point. I think when they have the hardball discussion on these spending bills is when the leadership of the speaker becomes an issue, and it is when I think at the time of the play or the movie that you might see an exit, because they may not be able to agree upon moving things forward, and the easiest way to do that is to say we need someone else in charge. So I would toss out that is when the time that I think his leadership will really be questioned, and if there ever was an opportunity to make a change, that would be the chapter that I could see easily happening.
And so when it comes to the debt ceiling, Steve, how nuclear do you think these guys are willing to go? You used a commonly used term by economists and bankers out there, which is the full faith and credit of the United States, and that actually is on the line. We know that the 2- and 10-year Treasury bills are the single most important priced items in the entire world. Every price is based off of those, ultimately, the U.S. has never defaulted. Does this wing understand and/or care about the ramifications of this, or do they even know what would happen to global financial markets, including the U.S.'s, if they were to go nuclear on this?
We're in an age where so many black swan events are stacking up. Once in a lifetime, once in a generation events are almost coming monthly. And this is one we're staring at the black swan, and a wing of the GOP wants to go catch that black swan, and the record government. You have to understand that part of a strain in American politics, which has always been there, has been to crash, is hyper nationalist to a point where that's where we call it isolationist, but they have no regard for global issues. They look at America as a victim of its international deals. They want to get rid of those obligations, a kind of pugnacious nationalism that is very disdainful and disregard for anything global, international, and that has always been. When I worked for Jeff Bingaman in the 1990s, and I would meet folks that came out of this strain in New Mexico. I think what's different today is they're on the internet, they're organized, they have leaders, members in Congress, and that wing has become more substantial of how to create a spike of political influence at various points, and they have grabbed the debt ceiling debate as a way to crash the government. There is a anti-government, almost anarchy, I think, that that some of these folks kind of fantasize about. So yeah, I do not underestimate the willingness of this wing. And so when you sort of say, are they rational? Do they know what crashing the full faith and kind? I just don't. I'm just telling you as honestly as I can. I know this is on the record. I don't believe they care, and that the goals that they think they have, that they're very committed to, are greater to them than the issue about America's credit rating. So yeah, I look at it as a very serious deal, and there are people willing to play it. And look, I mean, we're all set this tension up, and we're all tense about it. We may get to the brink and come back and be saved at the moment. But you used to sort of see that there was a kind of orchestrated dance where everybody would be rational and reasonable at the end. Now you can't be sure. That's the problem.
Sorry, and I think that's why where Steve started with Mitch McConnell is going to be so important in these discussions. I think the Senate has moved more towards the center. Of course, the margins are really close, but there are going to be some key upcoming Senate races in the next cycle, and I think McConnell is going to be a bigger player than maybe many think, and how this plays out of really trying to move the House, not necessarily towards the center, but be more rational about their approach, particularly on its effect on the economy. So keep an eye on how Mitch McConnell plays between not only the Speaker, but the White House and business leaders, because, it was a big deal for him to show up on that bridge with two, I guess, was it two senators, one senator, two Republican senators, and one Republican governor, to shake the hand to talk about a crowning, a legislative achievement by the White House and Congress. I think you'll see more of that, and hopefully, as I mentioned, that the Senate being more in the center, maybe there'll be some positive things that come out of that will kind of sidetrack, hopefully, what we're all concerned about, what might come out of the House.
One more quick thing on Mitch McConnell to add to what Orson said is, remember, I mean, so I agree with everything Orson just said, but there's a little bad blood between Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer the last time we went around this bend, because, and I can't get into it, but I'll just say there may have been some deal somewhere out there that Mitch McConnell would deliver those 10 votes, deliver the 10 votes to get the debt ceiling issue dealt with. and was pushing, and that behind the deal, that the filibuster may have been preserved is sort of tied into that. So there was a deal, but the first thing that happened was Chuck Schumer came out and basically kicked McConnell in the teeth. And there were a lot of centrist Democrats, particularly Senator Joe Manchin, who were furious with Schumer for the disregard and disrespect for what McConnell had achieved in holding that and doing the mature thing. Now, I don't know if he holds grudges or not, but the last time McConnell had to bring people around, Chuck Schumer treated him like crap and basically crapped all over what he did. So I think that's an issue that I don't know how it's going to play out again, but we have to remember now that McConnell, who is now the longest serving leader of any party in history, he's been around this a lot of times. And I don't know if he's going to give Schumer the opportunity to do that again. And so that's another interesting side dimple of this debate. I don't know where it goes. So, just McConnell saving the day on this probably happens, but last time he did it, the Democrats were not, at least Chuck Schumer was not helpful in terms of creating goodwill around that step.
Okay, guys, I'm cognizant of the time here, so we're going to go to the speed round. I'm going to come to each of you on a subject, and if we could just try to keep it tight, would be great. So, Orson, you spoke about corporate interaction with Congress vis-a-vis China. Let's pull back a little bit and just think about your sort of ideas here right now on best practices engaging this Congress. We talked a lot about the speaker, but I know you and I we've discussed how companies also ought to be interacting with Hakeem Jeffries and the Democratic side. So, what are your thoughts on that as we head into this 118th Congress?
So it's a layup right now for CEOs and business leaders if they haven't done so to send congratulatory notes to definitely the speaker, to Hakeem, to all of the leaders in Congress, just letting them know that they appreciate their support and more importantly, want to be a thought partner in whatever they may be considering. So if you haven't done so, it's an easy thing to do. Steve knows, and I know as someone who's worked in the White House, in the mayor's office, in the governor's office, politicians read handwritten notes. So for those of you that don't do it, reconsider it. But for business leaders, the things that I think quickly that they should be concerned about is, as Steve said, there ain't going to be a whole lot of legislative activity, but there will be a whole lot of executive orders rolling out in the next 6 months. So, really reaching out to the White House early to make certain that those issues that you care about, that they know about. Secondly, the regulatory bodies for our corporate clients, they need to be paying attention to. We saw the big rollout over the last 48 hours on non-competes at the FTC. I think you'll see more of that related to antitrust, particularly at the FCC. The SEC rolled out their climate disclosure program. Look for that to become a potential target in this ESG woke discussion. Congress and CFIUS on mergers and acquisitions, particularly related to China, deals to be heavily scrutinized would be something I would be concerned about. So, whether it's the ESG discussion, whether it's the woke discussion, whether it's moving supply chains, consumer pricings, I guarantee you that you'll see corporations testifying on the price of eggs in the next 2 weeks here. That is a big deal that hits home in the great state of Wisconsin. You hear that, Kevin? Great state of Wisconsin. The reshoring coalitions, the U.S. Chamber is a top target of this new Republican Congress because of some of the stance and support they took on the legislative front. CEOs and businesses are concerned about how their trade groups will play out or be supported in this new Congress. And then most importantly, the investigations and news cycles. We started this conversation on what this Congress might go after, but it's also the Senate. The Senate will be investigating Big Pharma, will be investigating China, will be investigating potentially consumer pricing. So that not only will it be on the House side, but you'll have a lot of senators asking a lot of tough questions, particularly on data privacy, technology that the business community should be concerned about. But more than anything else, to close it out, I really would keep a careful eye on some of these executive orders that are likely to come out. Some may come before the State of the Union, which is going to happen in a couple of weeks, or immediately after. That could have some really, really big impacts on many of our listeners and the business community.
Okay, so Steve, I want to pick up on that for you now. So obviously the administration after 2 years can actually point to a pretty interesting legislative track record, right? With the CHIPS Act, with the Inflation Reduction Act, the Electoral Count Act, the Protection of Marriage Act, the confirmation of Ketanji Brown Jackson. But clearly, with the new era of divided government, we're moving on to, as Orson suggested, the executive order stage and the regulatory stage of government. So, what do you expect now coming out of the key White House agenda? I guess going forward here.
I basically think that Orson covered it really, really well, and I think that the issues that come over, workforce issues and the social contract and what we've seen with the FTC, particularly in the non-compete stuff, and I also think the ESG side is going to be some area where the chamber begins to sue these. They are suing these agencies for overstepping their bounds. I think the leadership at the chamber is going to try to show that, in fact, it's not on board with all of the ESG direction and trying to basically define it in ways and challenging government to realize, from their perspective, is overstepping its lines. But I think the administration is going to keep, moving down that direction across the board. And I think Orson covered it. I think one of the interesting things I've seen is people like Gigi Sohn, who was had been dropped for an FCC commissioner role, has now been renominated. Joe Manchin was one of the opponents of her. Now they've got a net +1 vote, so they don't need Joe Manchin anymore. So they're going to probably bring back some of the folks that had not gone forward before. So you'll have, you're going to find, whether it's regulatory action, you're also going to just see nominations move much more quickly and robustly in the Biden team. And I think that drives news too well. And I think that while you've lined up a lot of things that look like Biden successes and clearly are, it's also going to look successful as he's getting more and more people confirmed into positions. And that's going to translate, in the minds of people, wow, Biden is moving. It's been interesting in some of the latest polls. Biden, for the first time ever, is up above 50% in terms of impressions and favorability in his ratings. So all of this has led to him getting a bit of an uptick, and I think that's going to probably continue with the appointments stuff.
Orson, it is argued by many that the Dobbs decision did impact elements of the midterm election. So as you look forward to the remainder of the Supreme Court's session, what are there absolutely significant decisions that are expected that you're anticipating, and what about cases that are to be argued?
Yeah, I don't think anything will come close to the Dobbs decision. I think that was a once-in-a-generation decision by the Supreme Court that really moved the needle, surprised the majority of pollsters, and if it wasn't for that decision, maybe Chuck Schumer wouldn't be where he is, and the margins wouldn't be as close as they were. Was a big deal in the great state of Wisconsin, in some of these battleground states. So I don't see any ruling coming out that could come close. There are a couple things on the menu, such as affirmative action, and could be some additional movement on gay marriage potentially, and that could be a driver. But I think what would be the biggest deal that would turn this town upside down if there was an opening on the Supreme Court, and the possibility, as we're hearing, since Biden is in charge, trying to find younger members of the Supreme Court and convincing Supreme Court members to consider leaving early so they can put in someone who can be there for the next 15 to 20 years. So the composition of the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court vote in this environment, I think, would be politically charged and would definitely be one of the top news items that come out of this town, in 2023. What do you think, Steve?
I totally agree with that. Don't know how it's going to go. I mean, you hear rumors all the time about, who they're trying to nudge off the bench or into, as Anthony Kennedy told me, he says he is not retired. He's just in a different status and he can still weigh in. So, they don't like to be calling themselves retired when they're off of that. But basically, change the composite of the justice would be a huge, huge story. But I have no idea where it's going to go or whether any of the associate justices right now will agree to step down. But there was a rumor about a couple of the judges that went like wildfire. We were trying to chase it down at Semafor and honestly got nothing. So don't know where it stands now.
And Steve, when all is said and done now, after the midterm elections and after the events of last week and the determining of the speaker ultimately, how do you see the position now of Donald Trump in the power hierarchy of the GOP? And do you anticipate, now that the January 6th committee has been disbanded, but the report has been issued and the recommendations have been made to the Justice Department, do you expect that that dog is going to bark again in a significant way, during the next year or so?
Well, I've seen everyone from Rachel Maddow and everyone else, speak breathlessly about the, legal hook coming after Donald Trump, and they have never got it quite right. And so I don't think we don't know what the special counsel is going to do or is going to go with that and to what damage. I mean, the interesting thing about Donald Trump is that the legal challenges he has, particularly from the federal government, tend to inflame and enhance his campaign stature rather than to detract from it. And I say this cautiously because I believed and wrote at the time that the air was going out of the Donald Trump balloon before the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago, that brought Donald Trump back. You saw a divorce going on in the media, separation going on between Rupert Murdoch's operations and Donald Trump. That resurrected Trump. And I think to a certain degree, it's a mixed situation. I think that we all know that with Marjorie Taylor Greene calling Donald Trump and him yelling at people on the floor in the last moments of that last vote of the 15th ballot, and him yelling at people to get on board with this and to step down, that was there. But we also saw Matt Gaetz tweet out when people saying, why aren't you doing what Donald Trump wants? And he says, well, Donald Trump's not very good with HR issues. We all know that. So there's been a disregard for Trump and definitely a diminishment, in my view, of his stature and footprint. But he's not out of the game. And I don't know how to predict whether the special counsel's actions on the legal issues that Trump is facing, that could actually swell him up more. But what I see is DeSantis hungry for the job. I see a lot of other people lining up. We see what Mike Pence is doing. And so I think that Donald Trump is becoming one of many again, but you should never underestimate his presence or impact. But I do sense, at least right now, this moment, a diminishment of Trump, but he's not out of the arena, to go back to Orson's great analogy at the beginning.
And finally, Steve, at the beginning of the call, Orson congratulated you and your colleagues on standing up Semafor last year. And for those who are unfamiliar with it, it's a great morning read. As you mentioned, you've broken news. So you've made a big splash. But there's been this kind of remaking of the Washington media ecosystem and names that not that long ago nobody had ever heard of before. The Politicos and Axios. These are as big in the town as the New York Times and the Washington Post are, and so on. So, talk a little bit about the space you guys have created and you're trying to.
Real quickly, our CEO Justin Smith, who was my boss at the Atlantic years ago, but he was the CEO of Bloomberg Global Media, and Ben Smith, who was the top media writer at the New York Times, but he was also the former editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed, and I first got to know him at Politico years ago. We all pretty much, know all the players. We're all kind of related and work for each other, knew each other in this town. But Ben and Justin, and I think I was a quick add-on to that. basically saw that there's an opportunity and a market opportunity, I hate to put it this way, but I'm just be honest, in the trust in news crisis out there. That right now there is just a fundamental distrust of media, and it's across from the right to the left. And we thought, is there a way, to take a page out of Axios's book in restructuring and deconstructing? They did smart brevity. Can we do something about bias and the perception of bias in media? Can we basically put forward a way to tell the news, give the writer's take, which admits the framing and scaffolding and bias and currents that Steve Clemons has about Joe Manchin and Joe Biden, and then can you build in a disagreement that's credible, that's alternative view? Can you build an international perspective or take to do that? And I have to tell you, we do that in our reported journalism, and I didn't know if it was going to fly or not. It's flying. We're growing like crazy. We're also breaking news. It was one of Ben Smith's really big insights. Operations Kadia Goba, breaking news like crazy. Liz Hoffman, so we hired from the Wall Street Journal, is running our business newsletter. Incredible story. She's just basically got zillions of people, following her now. Reed Albergati, who's our tech person in San Francisco. We hired Prashant Rao from The Atlantic as our global editor, and he produces our daily newsletter called Flagship out of London, which is a good, quick take on global affairs. I anchor a team of about 8 people that produce principles, on politics and policy in Washington each day, and we do a digest of all of this. But we build in, we curate smartly, but we build in alternative takes into what we're doing, and we expose our own writers' biases and frames, if you will. And I think that it's gone crazy. We're growing crazy, and we're hitting financial targets that were high. And so I hope people check out Semafor and sign up for Principles or Flagship or whatever other. We have tons of newsletters now. We've come on. Today is our 3-month anniversary, by the way. So happy birthday to us.
That's fantastic. And get it in your morning inbox. It's a good read. And I know you will be reporting from the World Economic Forum at Davos next week. So your insights will be coming in early in the morning on that.
Great.
So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you,
This year is going to unfold in interesting ways. I'm sure we'll have to revisit a lot of these subjects. So hopefully you'll come back. But Steve Clemons and Orson Porter, I want to thank you both for joining today, and thank everybody else for joining. Wish you a good day and a good long weekend here in the United States. And until next time, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a great day.